She told me to go die in a care home, not in anger, not in tears, not with any visible regret at all. She said it the way you'd comment on the weather, calm, practical, almost bored, while she placed my suitcase beside the front door of my own home. The home I have lived in for over 40 years. The home where I watched the light change through every season, where I memorized the sound the old floorboards make in winter, where I kept every letter my late husband ever wrote to me folded inside a cedar box on the top shelf of the wardrobe she now called her own. And my son, my Daniel, he was standing right behind her. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his eyes, the way a man does when he already knows he should have spoken and has decided, very quietly, that it is too late. I picked up that bag. I walked out. I didn't cry on the step. I didn't allow myself that. But what I need to tell you, what I need you to understand before anything else, is that what happened over the next 30 days was not the story of a woman who was thrown out of her house. It was the story of a house that had never, not for a single day, belonged to anyone but the man who built the trust around it, the man who had been gone for 12 years, and who, it turned out, had known exactly what silence does to a family. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 78 years old. I am a retired librarian. And I lived my entire adult life in a sandstone cottage on Kelly Street, Battery Point in Hobart, Tasmania. And I am going to tell you everything, because somebody should have said these things out loud a long, long time ago. Battery Point is not the kind of place that announces itself. It doesn't need to. It sits on a small peninsula jutting into the Derwent River, just a short walk south of Salamanca Place. And it has the quiet confidence of a neighborhood that has always known what it is. The streets there are narrow and uneven, full of sandstone cottages and Victorian terraces that have been standing since the mid-1800s, when sailors and shipwrights and merchants first built their lives along that waterfront. Kelly Street, where I lived, is one of the oldest residential streets in the suburb. The bluestone gutters, the iron fences, the smell of the river on a cold morning. I knew all of it by heart. I had walked those streets as a young woman, as a wife, as a widow, and as whatever it is you become after 70. My husband, Jeffrey, bought the cottage in 1978, the year we were married. It needed a great deal of work then. The kitchen had no proper ventilation, the back garden was entirely overgrown, and there was a persistent damp in the second bedroom that took him nearly a decade to properly address. But Jeffrey was a patient man. He believed in doing things correctly rather than quickly, and that quality extended to the way he structured everything in his life, including, I would eventually discover, the legal arrangements he made without ever once mentioning them to me. He passed away in 2012, a cardiac event, they said, though that phrase has always felt too clinical to me for something so devastating. He was 68. We had been married for 34 years. And because I was 66 at the time and had no interest in living alone in a cottage that felt too large for one person, I said yes when Daniel asked, about 18 months after the funeral, if he and Olivia might stay with me for a while. They had been through a very difficult period. Daniel's architectural consultation firm, which he had built over nearly 15 years, had collapsed following what he described as a series of unfortunate investment decisions made by his business partner. The debts were significant. The shame was worse. Olivia had her interior design work, but it was, at that point, inconsistent. They needed stability. I needed company. It seemed, as these arrangements often do at the beginning, like a sensible solution for everyone. That was in 2013. What I didn't fully understand then, what I allowed myself to overlook because I was lonely and because Daniel was all I had left, was that an arrangement made out of love can quietly become an assumption, and assumptions, left long enough without examination, begin to feel like entitlement. The changes were gradual. So gradual, in fact, that I spent years telling myself I was imagining them. The first thing Olivia changed was the sitting room. She redecorated it in the second year, which I understood. She was an interior designer, and the room did need refreshing. But she didn't ask. She simply cleared out the bookshelves I had arranged over decades, including the shelf where I kept Jeffrey's old navigation charts, which he had collected as a hobby, and replaced them with open shelving, displaying her own collected objects. When I mentioned that I had not been consulted, she smiled and told me the old arrangement had felt quite cluttered. Daniel said nothing. The second thing was my study. I had used the small back room as a reading space since we moved in. Olivia began using it as a design studio. When I raised this, she told me that the natural light in that room was simply better for her work, and that I was welcome to read in the sitting room. Daniel again said nothing. By the 5th year, I had learned to navigate around them in my own home. I took my tea in the kitchen when Olivia was working. I kept my personal items in my bedroom. I stopped inviting friends to visit because the dynamics had become too complicated to explain. The 2 friends I might have called, my dear Margaret Holt, who had retired to a cottage in Sandy Bay, and my former colleague Patricia Strand, who still volunteered at the State Library on Murray Street, had noticed the change in me and had stopped asking questions out of a kindness I did not deserve. Looking back on it now, with the clarity that only distance and time provide, I can see that I was doing what women of my generation were trained to do. I was accommodating. I was adjusting. I was making myself smaller so that the people around me could feel more comfortable. I called it love at the time. I understand now that it was fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of being alone, fear that if I insisted on being treated with basic dignity in my own home, I might lose the last family I had. The appointment that changed everything was, on the surface, entirely ordinary. My GP, Dr. Annette Russell, whose practice is on Davy Street in South Hobart, had been monitoring my blood pressure for several months, and she had asked me to come in for a follow-up review. It was a Tuesday in late June. Cold and gray the way Hobart gets in winter. Not dramatic, not stormy, just a steady, pewter-colored heaviness that settles over the city and doesn't lift for days. I remember that I had chosen to walk to the appointment rather than take the bus, because I always felt better for moving my body in the morning. The walk from Kelly Street through the back streets of Battery Point and up into the southern end of Hobart takes roughly 20 minutes at my pace. I know every corner of it. The Hampton Road shops, the little Anglican church on Churchill Avenue, the view of the river that opens up unexpectedly when you turn the right corner on Runnymede Street. The appointment itself was uneventful. My blood pressure was slightly elevated, but not dangerously so. Dr. Russell suggested I reduce my salt intake and try to sleep more consistently. We spoke briefly about a book she had recommended to me the previous month. I had been a librarian for 37 years, and we often found ourselves talking about books rather than strictly about medicine, which I suspect we both preferred. I left the surgery in good spirits. I stopped at the greengrocer on Criterion Street and bought a small bag of apples and some fresh ginger. I made my way home through the familiar streets, feeling, as I sometimes did on cold mornings, a kind of peace that came from simply belonging to a place. I opened the front gate on Kelly Street at approximately 12:15 in the afternoon. Olivia was standing in the doorway. My suitcase was on the step beside her. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think the details matter. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse me of anything. She was wearing a camel-colored cardigan, and her hair was very neat, and she held a cup of tea that she had made for herself and not for me, and she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as practical. She said that she and Daniel had been thinking about this for some time. She said that the house had naturally become their space over the years, and that they had plans for it. Renovation plans, Olivia explained with the light patience of someone who believes they are being kind, and that those plans would be difficult to execute while managing the additional consideration of another person living there. She used that phrase, additional consideration, as if I were a scheduling complication. She said she had looked into several very well-regarded residential facilities in the area. She mentioned one in Newtown, another near Lena Valley, both of which she described as perfectly comfortable for someone at my stage of life. She said she thought I would find it easier in the long run, to be around people my own age, in a setting designed for that purpose. And then, very calmly, very evenly, she said the words I will carry for the rest of my life. She said, "You'd be much better off somewhere like that, Evelyn. Honestly. This house has become our future, and you'd be happier in a place designed for people who need that kind of care." I looked past her. Daniel was in the hallway. He was holding his phone. He did not look up. I did not argue. I did not weep. I did not ask Daniel to look at me, though God knows I wanted to. I picked up the overnight bag from the suitcase. I left the suitcase on the step. I didn't want to drag it down the path in front of her, and I walked back out through the gate. I heard it close behind me, and I stood there for a moment on Kelly Street, in the cold June air, with my small bag and my apples and my ginger, and I thought, Jeffrey, what did you know? What did you put in place that I never thought to ask about? Because there was something pulling at me. Some old, half-remembered conversation we had once had about the house. A conversation from years ago, long before he became ill, long before any of this, in which Jeffrey had said something I had never fully understood. He had said, "Evie, I've made sure that no single moment of anger can ever undo what we built here." I had not thought about that sentence in years. Standing on the pavement outside my own front gate, I thought about it now. I didn't go to a care home. I walked to the end of Kelly Street, turned onto Hampton Road, and stood in the cold for a few minutes, thinking about where to go. My first instinct was to call Margaret, but something stopped me. Not pride exactly, but a feeling that before I spoke to anyone, I needed to think clearly. I needed somewhere quiet and private, somewhere I could sit with my thoughts without explaining myself. I called the Sandy Bay Guest House from the corner of the road using my mobile. It is a small, well-regarded establishment on the waterfront at Sandy Bay, about 2 kilometers south of Battery Point, occupying a restored Victorian house with a view out over the Derwent. I had recommended it to visiting academics over the years when I was still at the library. The proprietor, a kind and matter-of-fact woman named Janet Forsyth, answered on the second ring. I told her I needed a room for at least a week. She asked no questions and told me to come whenever I was ready. I walked there. It took me nearly 35 minutes in the cold, but I walked. When Janet opened the door and saw me with my small overnight bag, she took one look at my face and said, "I'll put the kettle on." She didn't say anything else about it. I will always be grateful for that. My room was on the first floor. It had a window that looked out over the water, and in the late afternoon light, the Derwent was the color of old pewter, flat and quiet and very wide. I sat in the chair by the window for a long time. I didn't cry. I just sat. And eventually, because there was nothing else useful to do, I opened my overnight bag and took out the things I had instinctively packed that morning before my appointment. As if some part of me had known, even then, that I might not be going straight home. Among those things was a small, battered journal I had been keeping for the past several months, and tucked into the back of it, folded into quarters, was a document I had almost forgotten I possessed. It was a letter from Jeffrey's solicitor, written the year after Jeffrey died. I had read it once, when it arrived, and placed it in the journal for safekeeping, and then, in the fog of grief and adjustment, had never given it the attention it deserved. I unfolded it now, smoothing the creases against my knee. And as I began to read, the light over the Derwent slowly faded, and the room grew dark around me, and I sat very still. Because what was written in that letter was not what I had remembered at all. I sat with that letter for a very long time. The room at Sandy Bay Guest House had grown completely dark around me before I thought to turn on the lamp. Janet had knocked gently at some point, I don't know what hour it was, to ask if I would like supper, and I had called back something vague and apologetic, and she had left a covered plate on the small table outside my door without any further comment. I found it later, cold but thoughtful, and I was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for small dignities when larger ones have been stripped away. But the letter. I need to tell you about the letter. It had been written by a solicitor named Robert Calloway, whose offices were on Macquarie Street in central Hobart, a short walk from the Supreme Court of Tasmania. Robert Calloway had been Geoffrey's solicitor for well over 20 years. I had met him perhaps 4 or 5 times across the whole of our marriage. He was a quiet, careful man with the kind of precise manner that made you feel your affairs were in very competent hands. Geoffrey had always spoken of him with tremendous respect, which was not something Geoffrey gave easily. The letter, which Calloway had sent me approximately 8 months after Geoffrey's death, was 2 pages long and written in formal but clear language. When I had first read it, in the fog of bereavement that follows the loss of a long marriage, I had understood it to be confirmation of what I already assumed, that the cottage on Kelly Street had been left to me, that the estate had been settled, that everything was in order. I had folded it away, filed it in my mind underdone, and moved forward. What I had missed, what grief had allowed me to miss, was the second page. The second page described, in measured and deliberate terms, something Geoffrey had established not after his death but during his lifetime. Several years before he died, working quietly with Calloway's office, Geoffrey had created a formal family trust. It was a fully registered legal instrument, lodged with the relevant Tasmanian authorities and tied directly to the title of the Kelly Street property. The trust had been structured carefully, Calloway explained, to ensure that the property could never be transferred, sold, redeveloped, renovated substantially, or placed under any new mortgage without the written consent of all named beneficiaries, and that any occupancy arrangement within the property required formal documentation under the terms of the trust deed. Geoffrey had established this trust, the letter said, not out of distrust of any particular person, but because he was, in his own words, and Calloway had quoted him directly, which told me this language had been deliberate, aware that family relationships can shift under financial pressure, and that the home we built together should never become a casualty of a conversation no one thought to have. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I read the rest of the letter. There was a clause I had absolutely no recollection of. A clause Calloway had underlined, gently and without drama, as if anticipating that it might one day matter more than it appeared to. The clause stated that if at any point the primary beneficiary, that was me, Evelyn Harper, was displaced from the property without formal legal agreement between all parties, the trust would be activated in full. And once activated, the trust required an immediate independent legal review, conducted by a solicitor appointed through the Supreme Court of Tasmania, to determine whether the terms of the original occupancy agreement had been observed. The occupancy agreement. I had to read that phrase twice, because I had not known there was one, or rather, I had signed something years ago before Daniel and Olivia moved in. I remembered a meeting in Calloway's office, a morning in early autumn, the 3 of us sitting around his desk and him explaining something about formalizing the arrangement. I had signed where he indicated. Daniel and Olivia had both signed. We had all shaken hands and gone to lunch afterward at a cafe near the waterfront, and the whole thing had felt, at the time, like a formality. A piece of paper to satisfy legal requirements. Something you did and then forgot about. I had forgotten about it. I suspect Daniel had as well. I am not entirely certain, sitting here now and thinking back on Olivia's very calm face that cold Tuesday morning, that she had. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes over you in moments of genuine shock when you are older and have already experienced enough of life to know that panic solves nothing. It is not numbness exactly. It is more like the sensation of standing on firm ground when you had expected to fall and needing a moment to adjust to the fact that the ground is there. That is what I felt, reading the second page of Robert Calloway's letter in that dimly lit room above the Derwent. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel anger, or at least not the hot, immediate kind. What I felt was something quieter and stranger, a combination of grief for the conversation Jeffrey and I had never had, and a slow, dawning recognition that my husband, who had always done things correctly rather than quickly, had done something quietly extraordinary. He had planned for this. Not for this moment specifically. Not for Olivia and her camel cardigan and her renovation plans, but for the human reality that love under pressure can become something else, and that a home should not be subject to that transformation without protection. The next morning, I telephoned Robert Calloway's office. A woman answered, not someone I recognized, and told me that Mr. Calloway had retired the previous year. I felt a brief and irrational grief about that, as if another small connection to Jeffrey had dissolved. But the woman was helpful and professional, and she informed me that the practice had been taken over by a senior partner named Diane Porteous, who had worked alongside Mr. Calloway for many years and was familiar with a number of his long-standing client files. I explained who I was. I explained, briefly and without drama, that I believed my late husband's family trust had been activated and that I needed legal guidance as soon as possible. There was a pause on the line, not long, but waited. And then she said Ms. Porteous would see me the following morning at 9. I thanked her, put down the phone, and sat back in my chair by the window. The Derwent was bright that morning, the sun cutting low across the water in the way it does on clear Hobart winter mornings when the light is silver-sharp and very beautiful. A small sailing vessel was moving slowly across the far side of the river, making toward the eastern shore. I watched it for a long time. There is something I want to say here, because I think it matters. In the days immediately following that morning, the days before I saw Diane Porteous, before anything had been formally initiated, before I had anything more than a 2-page letter and a 50-year-old habit of trusting my husband's judgment, I did not contact Daniel. I want you to understand that this was not a strategic decision. It was not the beginning of a plan. I have heard the story told back to me since by people who knew pieces of it, and sometimes it gets described as though I were playing some kind of long game. I was not. I was a 78-year-old woman sitting in a guest house above the Derwent with a small overnight bag and a very old letter, and what I was doing in those first few days was simply trying to understand what was true. That is not a strategy. That is survival. I did, in those days, read the journals I had brought with me. I have kept journals on and off since my 40s, nothing daily or disciplined, just periodic entries when something seemed worth recording. The ones I had with me covered roughly the last 2 years. Reading them back, in that quiet room, was a strange and sometimes painful experience. Because the distance that journals give you, the way written words on a page show you what you could not see when you were living through something, was considerable. Entry after entry, I had recorded small incidents that, at the time, I had described in neutral terms. The afternoon I returned from the library's volunteer reading group to find my reading chair moved to a different corner of the sitting room. The morning I discovered that Olivia had arranged for a tradesperson to assess the back garden for landscaping potential without mentioning it to me. The Sunday in March when I overheard Olivia on the phone saying that the situation with Jeffrey's mother was more complicated than we'd initially planned for. Jeffrey's mother. She had called me Jeffrey's mother, not Evelyn, not Mum, which she had occasionally used in the early years, not even Daniel's mother, Jeffrey's mother. As if my entire identity had been reduced to a relational footnote attached to a dead man. I sat with that for a while. And then I picked up my pen and wrote in the margin beside that entry, in the careful handwriting I have had for 60 years. She was already planning. The meeting with Diane Porteous took place on a Thursday morning. Her offices were on Macquarie Street, in a building I knew well from my years at the library. A sandstone block that had been there since the late 1800s, with high ceilings and the kind of institutional quiet that comes from decades of serious purpose. Diane Porteous was perhaps 60, with dark hair cut short and a manner that was warm but economical. She said what needed to be said and trusted you to keep up. I liked her immediately. She had, as the receptionist had mentioned, worked with Robert Calloway for many years, and she had my file open on her desk when I arrived, which told me she had prepared carefully for the meeting. She confirmed what the letter had indicated. The family trust was real, registered, and legally binding. The occupancy agreement, which all three of us had signed in the autumn of 2013, was also real, and it contained provisions I had not paid attention to at the time. The agreement required that any material change to the occupancy arrangement, including the removal of the primary beneficiary from the property, required the written consent of all parties and formal notification to the trust administrator, who was, in the event of Mr. Calloway's retirement, a designated officer of the Supreme Court of Tasmania. No such notification had been given. No such consent had been signed. What had happened on that cold Tuesday morning on Kelly Street, Olivia placing my suitcase on the step and telling me to go somewhere more suitable for people at my stage of life, constituted, in formal terms, an unauthorized alteration of the occupancy arrangement, which meant the trust was now in activation. Diane Porteous explained this to me without drama, in the same tone she might use to describe a property boundary. She told me she would need to file a formal notification with the court, that an independent review would be appointed, and that the process would take, she was careful to be honest, several weeks at minimum. She asked if I had somewhere stable to stay. I told her about Sandy Bay Guest House. She nodded and said that was fine. She asked if I intended to contact Daniel or Olivia. I told her I did not know yet. She said that was also fine, and that under the terms of the process, formal notification of the review would be served to them through the court, so I did not need to make that call myself. I asked her, before I left, what she thought Jeffrey had intended. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Mr. Harper was one of the most deliberate clients I ever observed. He didn't put provisions in documents because he expected them to be used. He put them there because he didn't want anyone, including you, to have to fight without protection." I thanked her. I walked back out into the cold morning air on Macquarie Street. The Supreme Court of Tasmania was a short distance away, its Georgian facade very still and correct in the winter light. I stood on the pavement and looked at it for a moment. Jeffrey had walked past this building hundreds of times. He had walked these streets with me when we were first married, when Hobart felt enormous and full of possibility. He had walked them in the last years of his life, more slowly, more quietly, when I sometimes held his arm on uneven ground. And somewhere in the long middle of those years, he had walked into a solicitor's office and made arrangements that I had signed without reading carefully enough. I had spent most of my adult life surrounded by documents. I was a librarian. The preservation and organization of written material was my profession. And yet the most important document in my own life had sat folded in the back of a journal for over a decade, while I quietly made myself smaller in my own home. If you are watching this, and you have ever done the same thing, made yourself smaller, told yourself the accommodation was love, signed something and forgotten about it because trusting someone felt more important than understanding the terms, then you will understand exactly what it felt like to stand on that Hobart pavement in the cold and feel, simultaneously, foolish and protected. Both of those things were true at once. And I was learning, at 78, that two contradictory feelings can occupy the same moment without either of them being wrong. I want to pause here for a moment, because something you just heard matters more than it might seem. If this story is reaching you, if Evelyn's voice feels like something worth sitting with, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Stories like this one don't find their audience by accident. They find people who have lived enough to know that the most important things are almost never the loudest. If that is you, I would ask you to subscribe, because there are more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them is told by someone who learned something the hard way and is generous enough to share it. The button is right there. It costs nothing, and it means everything to a channel like this one. Now, back to Kelly Street. Because while I was sitting in that guest house room, reading letters and journals and beginning to understand the shape of what Jeffrey had built, the court notification was being prepared. And across the city, in the sandstone cottage on Kelly Street, two people were about to receive a piece of official correspondence that neither of them had expected. I did not know, at that point, how Daniel would react. I thought I knew how Olivia would. I was right about one of them. I was entirely wrong about the other. The day the formal notification was served, I learned this later from Diane Porteous's office, which received confirmation of delivery, was a Friday. A clear, cold Friday, the kind of Hobart winter day when the mountain above the city is very sharp against the pale sky, and the air has that particular quality of being both still and piercing at the same time. I spent that Friday at the State Library on Murray Street. I had volunteered there for years and still occasionally helped out, and there was something deeply steadying about being among the stacks and the reading tables and the quiet industry of people engaged with written material. My former colleague, Patricia Strand, was working that day, and she looked at me with the careful attention of someone who had noticed changes over time and was choosing her moment. At a certain point in the afternoon, over tea in the small staff room, she said very simply, "Are you all right, Evie?" And I told her, not everything. Not the legal details or Diane Porteous or the trust provisions. But I told her what had happened on Kelly Street, the suitcase on the step, the camel cardigan, Daniel and his lowered eyes. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised me. She said, "I've been wondering when you were going to tell me that." I asked her what she meant. She said she had seen it building for years, that any time she had encountered me at events or functions over the past several years, I had seemed, she searched for the word, muted. That was what she said. Muted. As if someone had turned a dial, and I had simply accepted the new volume as normal. I thought about that word for the rest of the day. Muted. And I thought about Jeffrey, who had always said I had the clearest voice of anyone he knew, that when I was passionate about something, there was no room in the conversation for uncertainty. He had loved that about me. It was one of the first things he had ever said to me, standing in the university library where we had met, when I had argued with him about the merits of an obscure Tasmanian maritime history, and he had listened with a kind of delighted attention I had never forgotten. I had been muted, and I had let it happen. But here is the thing about going mute when you are not naturally a quiet person. The silence accumulates. And when something finally gives it a shape, when an old letter unfolds in a darkening room above a river, and you read your dead husband's words about protecting what was built, that silence doesn't disappear. It transforms into something altogether different. Something that, in the days to come, I would need to be very careful about how I used. Because what was beginning to move through the legal machinery of the Tasmanian court system was not a weapon. It was, I had to keep reminding myself, exactly what Jeffrey had said it was, a protection. And protections, used correctly, do not destroy. They reveal. What they were about to reveal, on Kelly Street and in Macquarie Street offices, and in the records of a family trust that had been sitting quietly for over a decade, was not the story of a woman wronged. It was the story of a family that had stopped telling each other the truth. And somewhere inside the files that Diane Porteous's office was now carefully gathering, renovation receipts, mortgage correspondence, charitable records, decades of household accounts, there was a detail that I had not yet encountered, a detail that had nothing to do with property rights or occupancy clauses, a detail about Jeffrey himself, something he had done quietly and without telling me in the last years of his life, something that would change everything I thought I understood about why he had built the trust the way he had. I have always believed that the truth arrives in its own time, not when you demand it, not when you think you are ready for it. But in the particular moment when the accumulated weight of everything you did not know finally exceeds the capacity of the ordinary day to contain it. For me, that moment arrived on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after I had walked out through the front gate of my own home carrying an overnight bag and a small paper sack of apples. I was sitting in Diane Porteous's office on Macquarie Street. The room was warm and very orderly, with tall windows that let in the pale winter light at an angle that made everything on the desk look deliberate. The stacked files, the glass of water, the pair of reading glasses she had set down beside a manila folder that I had not yet been invited to open. Diane had asked me to come in person rather than speak on the telephone. She had said, when her assistant rang to arrange the meeting, that there were documents she wanted me to be able to see properly. I had assumed this meant further legal material, trust provisions, court correspondence, the kind of formal papers that required signatures and witnesses, and the careful notation of dates. I had not anticipated what was actually inside that folder. She placed her hands flat on the desk in the way she had of preparing you for something without alarming you, and she said, "Evelyn, before we go through the court update, I need to show you something that emerged from the document review. It isn't directly a legal matter, but I think it is the most important thing in this room today." She opened the folder. Inside were photocopies, not the dry, bureaucratic kind, not mortgage records or title certificates, though those were there too, in a separate stack. These were copies of handwritten pages. Pages I recognized immediately, because I had lived with the handwriting on them for 34 years. Jeffrey's handwriting, not the formal, measured script he used for professional correspondence. The other kind, the looser, more personal version he reserved for his journals and his letters to me, and the notes he sometimes tucked inside library books he thought I should read. I looked at Diane. She nodded, very slightly, and I reached across and took the pages. There were 6 of them, written on unlined paper, in dark blue ink, undated except for a seasonal reference at the top of the first page. Winter, he had written, and a year. The year was 2009, 3 years before he died. The pages were not a journal entry, and they were not a letter. They were something in between. A private account addressed to no one in particular, in the manner of a person who is trying to think something through by writing it down. Jeffrey had always done that. When something troubled him, and he didn't yet know what he thought about it, he wrote. I had known this about him. I had simply never seen what he wrote during those sessions because I had understood, without ever needing to be told, that they were not for me to read until he was ready to share them. He had apparently decided, via Calloway's office and the trust administration, that the right moment for me to read them was this one. I want to tell you what was in those pages, but to tell it properly, I need to first tell you something about Jeffrey that I had always known, but had perhaps not thought about clearly enough in the 12 years since his death. Jeffrey Harper was not a demonstrative man. He was not cold, not at all. He was quietly and consistently warm in the way of people who express love through attention rather than declaration. He remembered things. He noticed things. If I mentioned in passing that I had been thinking about a particular author, the book would appear on the kitchen table within the week. If I said I was tired, he would arrange, without fanfare, for the following weekend to contain no obligations. He was the kind of man who loved you through logistics, and it had taken me years of marriage to understand that this was not a lesser form of love, but simply a different language for the same thing. What I had known less clearly, what the pages in my hands were beginning to show me, was that Jeffrey had spent the last several years of his life quietly managing something that he had chosen not to share with me, not out of deception. I understood that immediately, reading his handwriting on that cold morning. The tone of the pages was not the tone of a man concealing something. It was the tone of a man trying to protect someone from worry, which is a different thing entirely, though the line between them can be very fine. What Jeffrey had been managing was this. In the years following Daniel's business collapse, the collapse that had brought Daniel and Olivia to Kelly Street in the first place, Jeffrey had discovered, through a combination of careful attention and a quiet conversation with Daniel that Daniel had apparently never intended to be as revealing as it was, that the debt from the failed firm was considerably more serious than Daniel had admitted to either of us. The official figure that Daniel had mentioned, the amount he had described to us as significant and had attributed to his former partner's decisions, was, in fact, a partial accounting. The complete picture, which Jeffrey had pieced together through his own inquiries, involved a second creditor, a personal guarantee Daniel had signed without telling anyone, and a liability that, if called in at the wrong moment, could have resulted in consequences far beyond embarrassment. Jeffrey had not confronted Daniel about this. He had not told me. What he had done, instead, was consult Robert Calloway and quietly arrange a financial buffer, drawing on his own savings and a portion of a long-term investment account he had maintained separately throughout our marriage, to ensure that the secondary creditor would be satisfied before the guarantee could be called in. He had done this without Daniel knowing. He had done this without me knowing. And he had done it, as far as I could tell from his written words, simply because he did not want Daniel to carry the particular shame of a failure that had been partially his own making. He did not want his son to be destroyed by something that could be quietly, invisibly managed. He had written, "I am not saving him from consequence. I am saving him from the kind of permanent wound that stops a person from being able to try again." I read that sentence twice. Then I set the pages down on Diane's desk and looked out the window at Macquarie Street for a long time. The mountain above Hobart was visible at the top of the street, very clear and snow-edged in the winter air. I had looked at that mountain thousands of times from different angles across my life in this city. From the waterfront, from the library windows, from the back garden of Kelly Street on clear evenings, it always looked different depending on where you were standing. I thought, I have been standing in the wrong place to see what Jeffrey was doing. Not wrong in the sense of failing him. I think he had arranged it precisely so that I would not see. He had known, as he knew most things about me, that if I had known Daniel was in that much difficulty, I would have insisted on being involved. I would have spoken to Daniel directly. And Jeffrey had calculated, with the quiet precision he applied to everything, that my involvement would have required Daniel to face his own pride in a way Jeffrey did not think would serve any of them well. So he had managed it from a distance. He had arranged the buffer. He had structured the trust, partly, as a way of protecting the Kelly Street property from ever being caught in the crossfire of debts or financial pressures that he could see gathering on the horizon. And he had written these pages in the winter of 2009 as a private record, not a confession, not an accusation, but an explanation. An explanation addressed ultimately to me, because he had known on some level that I would eventually need to understand why. I am going to be honest with you. When I put those pages down, the first thing I felt was not gratitude. It was grief. Pure, clear grief. Not for Jeffrey's death, which I had already learned to carry over 12 years, but for the specific loss of this conversation. The one we should have had. The one where I might have said, "You can tell me. You can show me the hard thing. We have been doing this together for 30 years, and you do not need to carry the weight of protecting everyone alone." We never had that conversation, and now we never would. The grief of that sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of that morning. But underneath the grief, once I had let myself feel it properly, there was something else. Something that, as the weeks of this process had begun to unfold, I was slowly learning to distinguish from the complicated tangle of everything else I was feeling. It was clarity. Jeffrey's pages explained the trust. Not just the legal mechanics of it, Diane could explain those, but the human reasoning behind it. He had not built the trust out of suspicion of any particular person. He had built it because he understood, from years of quietly watching the way families function under financial pressure, that the home they had built together was the one stable thing. And stable things, when people are frightened, have a way of becoming contested. He had simply made sure that if it was ever contested, it would be contested correctly, with process, with time, with the intervention of impartial professionals. Not in a doorway on a cold Tuesday morning while one person's suitcase sat on the step. Diane let me sit quietly with all of this for a while before she moved on to the court update, which I will always be grateful for. She had the good judgment to recognize that some information needs to be absorbed before any further information can be usefully heard. When I was ready, she walked me through where the legal review stood. The formal notification had been served on Daniel and Olivia. Diane confirmed this with the quiet factuality she brought to everything. They had received the court documentation the previous Friday, exactly as I had known they would. What she was now able to tell me, based on the court's response and some preliminary correspondence through the appointed review officer, was that Daniel had engaged his own solicitor, a man named Stuart Baird, whose practice was in the Sandy Bay area, and that initial contact between the two offices had been made. She said the tone of that initial contact had been measured, not hostile. She used that word specifically, measured, and it told me something about Daniel that I had been wondering about since that Tuesday morning. Daniel had not known. I mean this in the precise sense. He had not known about the full extent of the trust provisions, or about the occupancy agreement clause, or about what Jeffrey had arranged before his death. His solicitor's measured tone suggested not the posture of someone who had been caught doing something calculated, but someone who was genuinely trying to understand what they were dealing with. Which brought me, slowly and painfully, to a distinction I had been avoiding. There is a difference between a person who does a harmful thing knowingly and a person who does a harmful thing because they have allowed someone else to make the decisions without examining them closely enough. Both can cause tremendous damage. I was not inclined, sitting in Diane Porteous's office on that winter Wednesday, to minimize what had happened to me on Kelly Street. The suitcase on the step was real. The words were real. Daniel's silence was real. But the question of what each of those things meant about the person responsible for them, that was a more complicated question than I had initially allowed myself to consider. And it was not a question I could answer yet, not without more time and not without more truth coming to the surface. Because the document review, which Diane's office was conducting in parallel with the court process, was continuing, and it had already produced one significant surprise in the form of Jeffrey's pages. Diane had indicated, carefully and without overstating it, that there were further financial records still being examined. Records relating to the property itself, to renovation work that had been carried out over the past several years, to what those renovations had cost, how they had been financed, and what, if anything, had been applied for or claimed in relation to the property's official valuation. She did not say more than that, not yet. But I heard what she was not saying, and I filed it carefully away. I left Macquarie Street that day carrying Jeffrey's pages in my bag. Diane had provided me with the photocopies, and I held them with both hands as I walked, as if they might otherwise be taken by the wind that was coming in off the river, cold and sharp and very present. I walked to Salamanca Place. I don't know exactly why. I think I needed to be somewhere that felt like the whole of the city rather than any particular piece of it. Salamanca Place, with its long row of Georgian sandstone warehouses converted over the decades into galleries and restaurants and market stalls, has always felt to me like the most honest part of Hobart. It is where the working character of the city's past sits in plain view, not hidden or dressed up, but acknowledged and used. The warehouses were built in the 1830s for storage and commerce, and they are still being used. Differently, yes, but purposefully. There is a lesson in that, I think, about the value of a solid structure that was built to last. I sat on one of the benches near the waterfront end of the square and read Jeffrey's pages again, all 6 of them from beginning to end, in the cold air with the sound of the water behind me. The second reading was different from the first. The grief was still there, but it had settled, the way grief does when you have acknowledged it properly rather than trying to manage it. What I could hear more clearly on the second reading was Jeffrey's voice, not the voice of the legal documents or the formal trust provisions. His actual voice, careful and specific, and quietly convinced that doing the right thing was worth the inconvenience of doing it correctly. He had written, near the end of the final page, "I do not expect to be thanked for any of this. I expect only that when the moment arrives, and in families, some version of this moment always arrives, the people I love will have the time and the proper support to find their way back to each other. Find their way back to each other." I folded the pages and put them back in my bag, and I sat for a while looking at the Derwent, which was bright and cold and moving in the way that rivers do. Without urgency, without pause, simply continuing. I thought about Daniel at 23, newly qualified, full of the particular confidence of a young man who believes he can build something. I thought about him at 40, sitting across from me in Diane Porteous's predecessor's office, signing a document he had probably not read carefully. I thought about him standing in the hallway of Kelly Street with his phone, not looking up. And I thought about the fact that somewhere in the financial records still being examined, in the renovation receipts and the mortgage correspondence and whatever else Diane's office was carefully working through, there might be a version of Daniel that I had not yet been shown. Not a villain. I had never believed in villains, not in real families, but perhaps a man who had made choices under pressure that he had not found a way to speak about, and perhaps a woman, Olivia, with her camel cardigan and her renovation plans, who was not entirely what she appeared either. Not better. Not worse. Just more complicated than a doorway conversation on a cold Tuesday morning had allowed either of us to be. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I know some of you have been with this story since the beginning, and I want to say something directly to you. Not as Evelyn, as the voice behind all of these stories. This channel exists because people like you, people who understand that the most important stories are the quiet ones, the ones about dignity and silence and what we owe each other across a lifetime, deserve a place where those stories are told with the care they require. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. And if this story has made you feel something, if Jeffrey's words or Evelyn's walk along Salamanca Place landed somewhere real for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. That is how these stories find the people they are meant for. The following week was a quiet one, externally. The legal process moved at its own pace, as legal processes do, and there was nothing for me to do but wait and think and occupy the hours of my days in ways that did not involve sitting in a guest house room measuring the distance between who I was and who I had allowed myself to become. I walked a great deal. Battery Point, which I deliberately did not enter. I was not ready to walk past Kelly Street, but the surrounding streets and the waterfront paths that I had used for decades. The track along the foreshore below Sandy Bay, where the river widened and the eastern shore of the Derwent was just visible in the middle distance. The path up through the domain, past the Royal Tasmanian Botanical Gardens, where Jeffrey and I had spent many weekend mornings in the years when we were both still working, and those mornings felt like small islands of peace in busy weeks. I thought about what it means to wait for truth, not for a version of truth that confirms what you already believe, but for the real kind, the kind that is larger than your own experience of events, that includes the experiences of people you love and people you are angry with, and people who are both of those things simultaneously. That is the hardest kind of waiting, because it requires you to hold your own certainty lightly, to stay open to revision, to accept that what you knew on the step of your own house with your overnight bag in your hand was real and true, and also possibly incomplete. Patricia Strand came for tea one afternoon that week at Sandy Bay Guest House. Janet Forsyth produced a proper spread without being asked. Sandwiches and scones and the good tea, not the utility kind, and the three of us sat in the small front sitting room while the winter light faded over the river and Patricia told me, quietly and without editorializing, what she had observed in the years she had known both me and Daniel. what she said surprised me less than I might have expected. She said Daniel had changed in the years since the business collapse. Not simply in confidence, that was obvious, but in something harder to name. A kind of attentiveness, she said, as if he was always watching for something, as if the ground beneath him had shifted once and he had never fully trusted it again. She had seen him occasionally at public events and gallery openings, the kind of Hobart cultural gatherings where you encounter the same people reliably across years. And she said that at those events there was a way he deferred to Olivia that was not the comfortable deference of a secure partnership, but something that looked, from the outside, more like a man who has decided that someone else's confidence is a reasonable substitute for his own. I sat with that, and I thought about Jeffrey's pages, about the secondary creditor, about the personal guarantee Daniel had signed and never spoken of, and I thought, what does it do to a man to carry a debt of that size in silence for that long? Not the financial debt. That had been quietly addressed. I understood that now. The other kind. The private, invisible kind that accumulates when someone you love protects you from a consequence without ever letting you know they did it. Daniel had never known what Jeffrey had done for him, which meant Daniel had spent years believing he had survived his own failure on his own terms, which was not, strictly speaking, true. And somewhere in the next stage of this process, in the financial records and the renovation receipts and whatever else was surfacing in Diane Porteous's careful review, I had the growing feeling that the truth about the Kelly Street years was not going to look the way either of us had assumed. Not for me. Not for Daniel. And least of all, I suspected, for Olivia. Because there was one document in the review stack that Diane had mentioned only in passing in the last few minutes of our Wednesday meeting before I had left Macquarie Street. A planning application, submitted to the Hobart City Council's Development Assessment Office 18 months earlier. In both names, Daniel and Olivia Harper, for a property described in the application as their primary residence, on Kelly Street, Battery Point. A planning application, submitted 18 months before Olivia placed my suitcase on the step. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I needed several days to sit with it myself before I could look at it clearly without the distortion that comes from hurt pride and wounded love. A planning application is, on its surface, a dry administrative document. It is a form submitted to a council office by people who wish to alter a property, to extend it, to renovate it, to change its use or its structure in some material way. It contains descriptions of intended works, assessments of impact, signatures of the property owners or their authorized representatives. It is, in other words, a piece of paper. But this particular piece of paper had been submitted to the Hobart City Council's Development Assessment Office using the Kelly Street address, and it had described that address as the primary residence of Daniel and Olivia Harper, without any qualification, without any reference to the occupancy agreement under which they lived there, and without any notification to me, the woman whose name was on the title, the woman whose late husband had established a trust that governed every material decision relating to that property, the woman who at the time of submission had been living in her own reading chair in her own cottage and telling herself the distance she felt was simply the natural consequence of sharing a home with adults who had their own lives. Diane Porteous had mentioned the application in passing. I understand now that she had done this deliberately, in the manner of someone who gives you the most significant information last and without emphasis, so that you have time to hear it properly rather than react to it. She had said, there is also a planning application that came up in the document review, and I would like to go through it with you in detail at our next meeting. Our next meeting was the following Monday. I spent the intervening days doing what I had learned, across 78 years, to do when I needed to think clearly. I moved my body, and I kept my hands occupied, and I did not speak about what was on my mind until I had finished thinking it through. I walked. I read. I sorted through the remaining personal papers I had brought with me. Not the legal documents which I left to Diane, but the older things, the things that belong to a life rather than a case. Letters Jeffrey had written me during the 2 years before we married, when I was finishing my library science degree in Melbourne and he was working in Hobart, and we maintained the relationship across the Bass Strait on paper, the way people did then. Postcards from places we had visited together, a conference he had attended in Sydney, a holiday in the Otago region of New Zealand's South Island that we had taken for our 20th anniversary, and which had produced between us an inexhaustible private vocabulary of inside references and remembered moments. There was a postcard from Queenstown, New Zealand, that I had not looked at in many years. On the back, in Jeffrey's handwriting, he had written, "Evie, if we were starting over, I would start here. But since we are not starting over, I am glad we are continuing. All love, G." I stood in my room above the Derwent and held that postcard and felt the full weight of the 12 years since he had last been alive to write anything at all. And then I put it carefully back with the others and went downstairs to breakfast. Because what Jeffrey had taught me across 34 years was not how to grieve. It was how to continue. The Monday meeting with Diane was the most significant of all the meetings we had, and I want to tell it to you fully, because I think the details matter. She had the planning application on her desk when I arrived, along with the financial records her office had been reviewing over the preceding weeks. The stack was considerably larger than I had anticipated. Not just the planning document, but an array of supporting material that had been gathered through the court process and through the trust administrator's formal request powers, which gave the review access to financial records held by institutions connected to the property. Diane walked me through it methodically, in the way she walked through everything, starting from the facts, moving to the implications, leaving the emotional weight for me to carry in my own time. The planning application had been submitted 18 months earlier, as she had indicated. It described a proposed renovation of the Kelly Street property that was substantial in scope. An extension to the rear of the cottage, reconfiguration of the internal layout, replacement of the original kitchen, installation of a new bathroom, and, this was the detail that arrived with the specific quality of something significant, a change to the property's classification from a single-family dwelling to a mixed-use residential and commercial space, reflecting Olivia's intention to operate her interior design studio from the premises on a formal business basis. The application had been submitted in both Daniel and Olivia's names. It had not been approved. The Development Assessment Office had flagged several concerns relating to heritage overlay requirements in Battery Point. The suburb has some of the most stringent heritage protections in Tasmania, given the historical significance of its built fabric. And the application had been placed on hold pending further information from the applicants. But it had been submitted. And in the documentation supporting the submission, the property had been described, without qualification, as being wholly owned and occupied by Daniel and Olivia Harper. There was no mention of the trust, no mention of the occupancy agreement, no mention of me. Diane let me sit with that for a moment before she continued. The financial records, she said, told a story that required some context to interpret correctly. She wanted me to understand the context before I drew conclusions. The context was this. Over the years, Daniel and Olivia had been living at Kelly Street. They had contributed to the household in financial terms. Utility costs, maintenance expenses, groceries, and a series of smaller renovation and repair works to the property that had been undertaken with my general awareness, if not always my explicit formal consent. That was normal and expected, and entirely consistent with a shared occupancy arrangement of that kind. What the records also showed, however, was a separate stream of financial activity that was less straightforward. Olivia's interior design business, which had grown significantly over the years of the Kelly Street arrangement, had been invoicing clients and, in some cases, suppliers, using the Kelly Street address as its registered business premises. The business had, in the most recent financial year, generated an income that was considerably more substantial than I had understood Olivia's work to be producing. And a portion of that income had been applied to what the records described as property investment, a categorization that, on closer examination, appeared to relate to preliminary costs associated with the planning application. Architect fees, heritage consultant fees, soil tests, structural assessments. All of it applied to a property that was not theirs to redevelop. I want to be very careful here about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. What I'm saying is that the records showed a pattern of decision-making in which the Kelly Street property had been treated, incrementally and without formal acknowledgement, as though the occupancy arrangement were ownership. Small assumptions had become medium assumptions, and medium assumptions had, over time, produced a planning application in which my home was formally described to a government body as belonging entirely to other people. What I am not saying is that this was a deliberate scheme. I am not saying it because I do not believe it was. What I believe, based on everything I came to understand through this process, is that it was the product of something more ordinary, and in many ways more troubling than deliberate fraud. It was the product of a story that two people had been telling themselves for long enough that they had stopped noticing it wasn't entirely true. Diane finished her account of the records. She set the papers down and looked at me with the direct, careful attention she brought to every difficult thing. She said, "Evelyn, the review process is effectively complete. The court-appointed officer has made her assessment. I have the summary here." She handed me a formal document, several pages, cover sheet bearing the Supreme Court of Tasmania crest. I read it in her office. All of it. It took perhaps 20 minutes, during which Diane sat quietly and the winter light moved across the desk. The assessment was clear. The family trust was valid and enforceable. The occupancy agreement had been breached in material terms by the events of the previous month, my removal from the property without formal consent or notification, and by the submission of the planning application, which had been made without disclosure of the trust or the agreement to the relevant authority. The Kelly Street property remained, as it always had been, the primary asset of the trust, held for the benefit of the named beneficiaries in the terms Jeffrey and Calloway had established. Diane explained what happened next in practical terms. The court order would be issued. It would require the peaceful vacation of the property by Daniel and Olivia in accordance with a specified timeline, several weeks, to allow for reasonable arrangements. It would also require formal correction of the planning application record, noting the true ownership and trust structure. There would be no financial penalties, no criminal referral, no punitive action. The process Jeffrey had designed was not punitive, it was corrective. She asked me what I wanted to do. And here is the thing. I sat in that chair on that Monday morning with the court summary in my hands, and I thought about what I wanted. Not what I was entitled to. Not what the document said I could demand. What I actually wanted, and what I found when I looked at it honestly, when I set aside the afternoon on the step and the camel cardigan and 12 years of making myself smaller, was that what I wanted was not to win something. What I wanted was to understand how it had come to this, and I wanted Daniel to understand it too, not as punishment, not as demonstration of what his silence had cost, but because Jeffrey had written on that final page of his winter journal entry from 2009, "I expect only that when the moment arrives, the people I love will have the time and the proper support to find their way back to each other." Find their way back. I asked Diane to proceed with the court order, and then I asked her to help me draft something else, not a legal document, a letter. The court order was executed on a Thursday, 4 weeks and 2 days after I had walked out through the front gate of my own home. I did not go to Kelly Street that day. I had chosen not to. Diane had advised me that a court-appointed officer would supervise the process and that a removalist company had been engaged to assist Daniel and Olivia with the transfer of their belongings to the temporary accommodation they had arranged, a rental property in South Hobart, near Cascade, which I knew from the court correspondence, but had not looked up and did not intend to visit. I spent that Thursday morning at the State Library on Murray Street. Patricia was working, and she gave me a project, reorganizing a small collection of 19th century Tasmanian maritime records that had been donated by an estate and needed proper cataloging. I worked for 3 hours. I found it deeply, genuinely settling to hold old paper and put things in order. At a certain point in the late morning, my phone rang. It was Janet Forsyth from the guest house. She said there was someone at the front door asking for me. She said her voice had been composed, but her expression had not. I thanked Patricia and put on my coat and walked the 20 minutes back along the waterfront. It was raining. Not heavily. A fine, persistent Hobart rain, the kind that is almost a mist and covers everything with a uniform gray dampness that makes even familiar streets look slightly unfamiliar. Olivia was standing at the gate of Sandy Bay Guest House. She was wet through. She had not brought an umbrella. Her hair was flat against her face, and her coat was dark with rain, and she was standing very still in the way of someone who has been standing in one place long enough that they have stopped noticing the weather. I stood on the path inside the gate and looked at her. She looked at me. There was a long moment during which neither of us spoke, and the rain continued very quietly, and the Derwent was just visible beyond the roofline, gray and wide and indifferent. Then she said, "I didn't know about the trust." Her voice was steady. She was not crying. I had expected tears. I had prepared myself without quite acknowledging that I was doing so for a conversation that was emotional in the loud, urgent sense. What I found instead was something quieter. A woman standing in the rain outside a gate telling me what she believed to be true. I said, "I know you didn't." She blinked. I don't think she had expected that. I said, "Come inside, Olivia. You're soaked through." Janet had tea ready within 5 minutes, which suggested she had anticipated this, which in turn suggested she was considerably more perceptive than her businesslike manner implied. We sat in the front sitting room, the same room where Patricia and I had taken tea earlier that week, and the rain continued against the window, and I looked at the woman my son had married 21 years ago, and I thought about all the versions of this conversation we might have had and hadn't. Olivia talked. I listened. That is the honest account of the next hour. She did not make excuses, or when she began to, she stopped herself, which I respected. She spoke about the business, about the planning application, about the way the idea of the renovation had grown from a small conversation into something that had taken on its own momentum without her fully examining the assumptions beneath it. She spoke about Daniel, carefully, with the consideration of someone who knows they are talking about a person in the hearing of that person's mother. And she said that he had believed, in the way of someone who needed to believe it, that things were settled, that the Kelly Street arrangement was permanent, that my quiet accommodation of them over the years constituted a kind of ongoing permission. She said, "I let him believe that, and I think I believed it too, eventually." I said, "That is the thing about assumptions. They are very comfortable until they are not." She looked at her hands. Then she said, "Where is Daniel?" I said I didn't know. She said he had been very quiet since the court documentation arrived, that he had spent 3 evenings sitting in the kitchen of the South Hobart rental, not speaking very much. She said he had asked once, early in the process, whether his father had known, whether Jeffrey had anticipated this specifically, and that she had not known what to tell him. I reached into my bag. I took out the envelope I had asked Diane to help me prepare. Not a legal document. The letter I had requested, a letter containing a copy of Jeffrey's 6 handwritten pages, and a short note in my own hand that said only, "Your father did not do this to punish anyone. He did it because he loved all of us enough to plan for our worst moments. Please read this when you are ready, and when you have, I would like very much to see you both." I handed it to Olivia. She took it carefully, the way you take something when you understand its weight, without yet knowing its contents. I said, "There is an invitation inside as well. Not to the house, not yet. To a meeting. I would like the 3 of us to sit together and go through everything Jeffrey left behind. Not in a solicitor's office. Somewhere we can actually hear each other. She said, "Why would you do that? After everything?" And I thought about how to answer that, and I thought about Jeffrey standing in a solicitor's office in 2009, quietly arranging a buffer for a son who didn't know he needed protecting. And I thought about 34 years of being loved through logistics by a man who expressed everything important in action rather than declaration. I said, because that is what he would have done. The meeting took place 2 weeks later. Not at Kelly Street. I was not ready for that, and neither were they. And the house itself needed time to simply be what it was, without any of us filling it with the atmosphere of recent events. We met at a cafe near Salamanca Place, one that Jeffrey and I had visited regularly in his last years. A quiet place with good coffee, and the kind of unhurried service that allows a table to remain occupied for as long as the conversation requires. I arrived first. I sat facing the door, which is something I have always done in restaurants, a habit I could not account for except that it seemed important to see people arriving. Daniel came in first. He looked older than I had expected, which surprised me because I knew his age, and I knew his face, and I should not have been surprised. But grief and stress wear on people in ways that a mother's daily knowledge of a face can obscure, and the distance of the preceding weeks had restored to me a kind of clear vision I had not had in years. He sat down across from me. He did not speak immediately. He looked at me in the way of someone who has rehearsed several openings and discarded all of them. Then he said, "Mum, I didn't know what Olivia was planning." I said, "I know, Daniel." He said, "I should have said something. On the step, I should have. I don't know why I didn't." I said, "I think you do know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't want to choose." And there it was. The thing at the center of it, underneath all the legal documents and the planning applications and the renovation receipts and the occupancy agreement and Jeffrey's careful winter pages. The thing that would have been very simple to say on a step on Kelly Street and would have cost both of us much less than what followed. He had not wanted to choose between his wife and his mother, so he had chosen nothing, and in choosing nothing, he had chosen. Olivia arrived a few minutes later. She sat beside Daniel. She ordered tea without looking at the menu, which is what people do in places they have been before, and I registered this without comment. I placed Jeffrey's pages on the table between us. I had brought the originals, not the photocopies, the originals in Jeffrey's dark blue ink, in the loose personal script he reserved for things that mattered. I said, "I would like to read these aloud, if you will let me." Neither of them said no. So I read. All 6 pages, in the quiet of that Salamanca Place cafe, with the sound of the city and the waterfront just outside and the winter light coming through the windows at the low angle particular to Hobart in the cold months. When I finished, the table was very still. Daniel was looking at the pages in the way of someone who is trying to determine whether what they have heard is real. Then he said, very quietly, "He paid it." "He paid the guarantee." I said, "Yes." He said, "And he never told me." I said, "No." There was a long silence. Then Daniel said something I had not expected. He said, "He was protecting me from being grateful. He knew that if I knew, I would have spent the rest of my life trying to pay it back in ways that weren't about money, and that it would have changed everything between us." I looked at my son. I thought, there he is. There is the man his father believed in enough to protect quietly from a permanent wound. I said, "Yes, I think that is exactly right." Olivia said nothing for a while. Then she said, "I owe you an apology, Evelyn. Not a conversation about it, an apology." She paused. "I treated your home as though it were already mine. I told myself it was practical. It wasn't. It was presumptuous. And that word I used, I said you'd be better somewhere designed for people at your stage of life." She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "I am sorry for that. Sincerely and without qualification." I looked at her, and I found, to my own considerable surprise, that I believed her, Not because the apology was eloquent. It wasn't. It was halting and uncomfortable and visibly difficult, which is precisely the quality that made it believable. I said, "I accept that." I did not say, "It's all right." Because it wasn't, entirely, and she knew that, and pretending otherwise would have been a kindness that undermined the whole honesty of the moment. But I accepted it, and there is a difference. We talked for almost 3 hours, about Jeffrey, about Daniel's business and the years that followed it, and the particular kind of shame that follows a visible failure in a small city where everyone knows everyone's professional life. About Olivia's business and how it had grown, and the planning application, and the assumptions that had accumulated beneath it like sediment at the bottom of a clear river, invisible until something disturbs the water. About the years I had spent adjusting and accommodating and telling myself it was love. We talked about the house, about what would happen next. I told them that Kelly Street was not something I intended to sell or to close off. It was Jeffrey's structure and my home, and I would return to it, and I would do so without ceremony, which was the only way Jeffrey would have wanted it. I told them that what they did with their own lives and their own work from here was entirely their own matter, and that I hoped it would be built on things they had actually examined rather than things they had assumed. I told Daniel that his father had not paid that debt expecting gratitude. He had paid it expecting Daniel to eventually build something worth protecting. I said, "Whether you do that is still your decision. That part is not in any trust document." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. When we left the cafe, the rain had cleared. Salamanca Place, in the winter afternoon, without rain, has a particular quality of stillness. The stone of the warehouses holds the cold and the light both, and the waterfront is very quiet on days when the tourist season is far off. We stood on the pavement outside. Daniel hugged me. Not the careful, brief hug of the complicated recent years. The other kind. Olivia and I looked at each other for a moment, and I put my hand briefly on her arm, and she nodded once. Small, precise, sincere. Then we went in our separate directions. I walked along the waterfront. The Derwent was flat and very silver in the late afternoon light, and Mount Wellington above the city was clear and snow-edged and enormous in the particular way it gets when the air is cold and clean after rain. I thought about Jeffrey. I thought about what it means to build something meant to last, not a house, not a trust, something harder and more necessary than either of those things. A structure of honesty, the kind that holds people together not by binding them to each other, but by ensuring they cannot, when things become difficult, permanently damage what matters most through the careless application of pride or silence or the small daily choice to let things go unspoken. Jeffrey had known that silence, accumulated, becomes a wall. He had simply made sure that wall could not become permanent. I returned to Kelly Street the following Saturday. It was cold and very clear. The sandstone of the cottage on the morning light looked almost warm, which sandstone does on bright Hobart winter days when the sun is low and direct. The garden needed attention. A few weeks of absence had allowed the winter growth to become untidy at the edges, and I spent the morning working at it, which felt right, purposeful, properly mine. I had tea in my reading chair in the afternoon, the one that had been moved and moved back and moved again over the years. The bookshelves held my books and Jeffrey's navigation charts. The light through the sitting room window came at the angle I had memorized across 40 years. Everything that had always been mine was still mine. But I was not the same person who had walked out through that gate. I was someone who had read her husband's handwriting in a cold room above the river and finally understood what he had been quietly building for 34 years. And I had walked the length of Salamanca Place and sat in a cafe and read those words aloud to the people who needed to hear them. And I had come home. If this story reached something in you, if Evelyn's voice or Jeffrey's quiet, extraordinary love or the long walk back to something true felt like something worth holding on to, then please subscribe to this channel, There are more stories here, stories told by women who lived through things and came out the other side with something worth sharing. Every subscription tells us these stories matter, and every comment tells us you were here. If this one moved you, leave the word Kelly in the comments. Just that. No explanation needed. We will know what it means. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the most important things are almost never the loudest, and that it is never too late to find your way back.